Hello guys, welcome to Redditor's Revenge. Here we post amazing revenge stories daily. And if you want more content like this, please subscribe to the channel and stay tuned with us. Moving on to today's first story. Sometimes having a good job can be rewarding, but sometimes it can ruin your life. I 34 got the corporate job of my dreams. After 10 years of grinding and working 12-hour shifts and struggling with my wife, who had been with me since I was drooling over my cubicle, I got promoted enough to be among the top management team. I was still new and learning the ropes, but my life had taken a big shift. All of a sudden, we were attending meetings and traveling and always busy. I went from having nobody at work interested in what I did to attending 3-hour meetings constantly, and my wife, of course, had to be involved in all of this, as she frequently traveled with me if I didn't travel alone, and we hosted several dinners at our house. The most important one out of all of these people, though, was my boss. I had to do everything in my power to make him happy, as I really wanted to keep this job and didn't want any issues. I did him several favors and always wanted to be on his good side, but this meant making a few sacrifices sometimes. About a month ago, at work, my boss told me that we had to meet somewhere after work so we could discuss some issues. I thought this would be the perfect opportunity for him to come over and I could show him some hospitality, so I offered that he come over and have dinner with us and we can talk shop. He hesitated at first, but agreed. That day, I called my wife immediately to ask her to fix something up as my boss would be coming to dinner. She panicked a bit at first, but told me that she was up to it and that she would get it done. She was right, and we showed up to a table full of food. My boss was the kind of man who acted very charming, but you can sometimes feel like there's something under the surface. He had this strange vampiric charm to him. As soon as he entered, he kept complimenting our house and making us feel much better about ourselves than we do. He spoke to my wife very politely and cracked a few jokes which he rarely did at work. When we sat down for dinner, though, his attention seemed to be elsewhere. I kept bringing up the issue at work that we needed to discuss, but I felt like most of his attention was on my wife. He kept asking her how she and I met and about her past. She told him that she used to be an accountant at a big company, but that she was in between jobs right now and just taking care of the house until she found something. He was very friendly and kept asking her about details of her work and her education, and her upbringing. I felt ignored a bit and joked a couple of times that we needed to get back to the topic at hand. He kept complimenting the food, and again, all the compliments were directed toward my wife very charmingly. He told her about how he hadn't had a home-cooked meal in years and that he never got married because he never found the right person or whatever. I didn't know what he was up to, but I didn't like the way he was so interested in her. I tried several times to answer the questions he asked her, but he again waited for her answer most of the time. She didn't seem annoyed by him at all, as she was laughing the whole time. He made a couple of jokes about her being married to me which I didn't appreciate, but I figured this was just his nature. I brought up the issue at work again and we began to discuss it. It was an employee thing, and my wife shared her insights on the matter which he found super appealing, and soon enough he was discussing the issue with my wife more than me. At the end of the meal, he literally offered her a job at the company and took her number to send her the details, as she giggled and told him that she would think about it. When he left, I was furious. I argued with my wife about the way he was all over her, and how she was responding to him and laughing and acting interested. She told me that I was being delusional and that she was just showing hospitality and being nice so that we would leave a good impression, and told me that she was helping me get on his good side but that I was overreacting. I told her not to accept the job, but she told me that it was a good opportunity and that I was being distrustful. I calmed down a bit and realized that I might have come off as that, so I apologized, but I decided to keep a close eye on both of them. Over the next week, I felt like my wife was a bit distant. She wasn't as talkative as before and she was always on her phone texting. I was in denial of the idea, and I just thought that she was texting her friends. It was still very noticeable how she wasn't interested in a lot of activities together though, and it worried me. Work was no different. I was super busy all the time and there were a few days when I didn't see my boss around a lot. I had to stay at the office overtime and got home very late for a few days in a row when my wife had already been to bed. My boss was away on business, and when he came back, he seemed to be more occupied with his phone than usual. Even in meetings, he was always texting or busy, and it started affecting our whole job. I wanted to talk to him about this, so I went to his office one day to discuss it. He had me waiting in his office for like a good 10 minutes going over his phone and checking texts before we started talking. I tried as politely as possible to tell him that he was being distant, and that there were a few things at work we needed to talk about, but he took it the wrong way as if I was being rude, and asked me if I was doubting his work or competency or something, and I found myself in a position where I had to defend myself, but he overreacted badly and I was getting pretty embarrassed. I just told him that there were a few meetings that we had to attend, and all of a sudden, his phone, which was on his desk, rang. I glanced at the phone and find that it was my wife. He noticed that I noticed that it was my wife, and he picked up and went out of the office. He stayed out for a solid 5 minutes before coming back. When I asked him what my wife wanted, he told me that it was about the job he had offered her, and that she was calling to ask about the details. It made sense, but I politely tried to talk him out of that job offer, but again, he got agitated, and told me that I don't decide who he hires and who he doesn't. I was again in an awkward situation and just apologized, let it be, and left. When I went home, though, I had to check if both their stories lined up. My wife greeted me very warmly, but I was pretty cold. I told her that I noticed she called my boss earlier and asked her what that was about. She seemed a bit nervous and kept telling me that it was nothing and that it was just about a fundraiser she had an idea for and wanted to plan. Their stories didn't line up, as he said it was about the accounting job and she was talking about a fundraiser. I confronted her and told her that he said it was about the job, and I acted very Sherlock Holmesy, which she didn't appreciate. She got defensive and told me that the fundraiser thing was part of the job he offered and that it was an idea of hers for the company. She got very angry and told me that I was being presumptuous, judgmental, and paranoid. She went into a frenzy and even cried at the end. I tried to apologize and I thought that I really might have overreacted, but she asked me to sleep on the couch that night and that she feels distrusted. I did sleep on the couch that night, and for the next couple of days she was giving me the cold shoulder, and I came out as the bad guy at the end and had to buy her flowers and make it up to her. She said that we had been married for 7 years and that she never doubted that I was faithful. I tried to explain to her that it wasn't about being faithful, but just worried because I knew my boss had this vibe about him that I didn't like. She defended herself and insisted that she would take the job he offered her, and eventually I had to agree. The next day at work I got a warning from my boss for tardiness and being unfocused at work. It came out of literally nowhere and I had no idea why he did that, as I hadn't done anything at all. I felt some conspiracy at hand, so I went over to my best friend, who was also in the company in a different department, and started explaining everything to him. I could tell that he wanted to tell me that he felt there was something going on between my boss and my wife, but he kept beating around the bush and told me that I should just surprise one of them. I decided to take a couple of hours off and head home straight away without telling my wife. I get home and I find no one. My wife wasn't home and I called her several times and she didn't pick up. An hour later, she comes home all dressed up and asks me why I was home early. I asked her where she was all dressed up, and she told me that she had an interview with my boss. I was confused since I knew she didn't come over to the company, but she told me that it was a casual interview at a restaurant. I was again very doubtful but didn't want to come off that way. I asked her how the interview went and that was that. That night, though, my wife was in the shower and her phone rang. It was my boss. I let it ring for a bit, but then when he called again, I got an idea. I quietly picked up and didn't say anything. As soon as I did, he started talking very intimately and talked about their date, and he used some pretty inappropriate words. I let him go, but then he realized that nobody was answering and he hung up. As soon as my wife got out of the shower, I played the call for her as I recorded it, and she froze and started crying. I blew up in her face and told her that I doubted her from the beginning and that she has nothing to say for herself. I yelled at her and humiliated her for a good 5 minutes while she just stood there. At the end, I told her to go to her parents' house and that I didn't want her to stay at our house. She kept apologizing and telling me that it was just a mistake, but I threw the first clothes I saw to her and kicked her out of the house to her parents. She even had to walk 2 miles to the nearest bus station to get there, as she didn't even get the chance to take money or her purse for a cab or Uber. I had my unfinished business with my boss, though. I knew if I confronted him, I might get fired. I had to play it differently, so I kept digging around. The thing is, I hardly knew anything about his personal life. I didn't even know if he was married or not, since he never mentioned it, but other people in the company theorized that he had a wife that nobody had seen before. I wanted to know more about him, so I went to an extremely unlikely source, an ex-assistant. We had heard stories at the company that he had this assistant for 5 years and fired her for unknown reasons. I found her on LinkedIn and told her the whole thing and asked her if she could tell me any details that would help me expose him. She set up a meeting with me and we met in person. When I asked her why she got fired, she told me that it was because my boss had touched her inappropriately, and when she tried to report him or go to the authorities, he fired her and made sure she never worked in a big company again. She told me that she felt victimized and unjustly treated ever since, but gave me one spicy piece of gossip. She told me that my boss was married to one of the members of the board of directors, but they always kept it secret, and that he only got his position out of nepotism. This was the perfect opportunity for me to expose him. I went to my wife at her parents' house and after a million apologies by her, we came to a deal. I had her screenshot all the incriminating texts that they used to send, and some of the things he sent were sexual in a very, very embarrassing way. He even sent her inappropriate pictures. We hatched a plan where I wouldn't be involved in the slightest. The next day at work, I was in the office normally, when all of a sudden almost every employee that I knew got an anonymous message on their phone with all the texts and pictures, and people went nuts. I had gotten a lot of the numbers from that ex-assistant and had my wife send them anonymously. People were laughing and making noise on every single floor of the company, and my boss was in his office refusing to come out. All of a sudden, we found his wife, the board member, come down from her floor to ours, and she banged on his door hard. He had to get out and face everyone, and people stopped laughing for a moment and held it in. We saw her humiliating him in such a harsh tone and so loudly to the point that the entire floor heard her. At the end, she told him to pack his stuff and that he was fired and she didn't want to see him at the company again. Everyone started laughing again and some women started cheering, going up to him and slapping him across the face. This triggered a domino effect where so many women came forward with allegations that he verbally and sexually harassed them, and some he even touched, and they were too scared to do anything. As he was walking out, one secretary literally spit in his face and kicked him between the legs, and told him that she had had enough of him touching her all of these years. I still needed my own brand of revenge though, so I went over to the parking lot before he reached his car and I wrecked it to smithereens. I left a note on the car saying that this was for my wife, and I wanted to take a look at him from far away as he panicked as soon as he saw his Audi in pieces and grabbed the note and threw it away in a rage. His car was in such a bad condition that he had to wait for an Uber outside the company, where a bunch of people were still yelling at him and making fun of him. I still had one last thing up my sleeve. I contacted his ex-assistant again and pushed her to sue him, as he was on his last legs. She had enough evidence to sue him for sexual harassment, and the lawsuit would prevent him from having the same kind of job at all after he served his sentence or paid the fine. I wanted to get a divorce, but after my wife helped me and apologized a million times, I forgave her and things went back to normal. She explained that the only reason she felt attracted to him was that I was so busy with work that I didn't have time for her anymore, which I somewhat understood. With him out of the company though, I became next in line for his position. Now, here is the end of our today's story, and I hope you guys are enjoying my content. So before leaving, you guys can share your thought in the comment section about that asshole boss, and do you think Opus should forgive his wife after she cheated on him? I love to read your opinion. Also, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to stay tuned with us for more revenge stories.